of February 24th, 2020. We have a full crew to some extent. No Melissa here? No Melissa. I don't know how many people have said they're not going to make it, but we'll move on.
Yeah.
I heard from Ruben and heard from Chris. You heard from anybody else?
Carl and Joe.
Okay.
We're also not able to make it.
Okay. So everybody have an opportunity to review minutes from our last meeting in January?
Yes, I have an addition I'd like to make on regular business B. I would just like to add that a reference that I had asked whether Methuen had engaged with the baseball community, and that response was in the negative.
So what are you talking about?
In the minutes with respect to the park master plan, I don't know where we want to add it. We can just add it at the end.
Suggestion, I think the conversation was under Tibbetts Valley Park.
Under Tibbetts Valley Park. Mm-hmm.
And I think the response was that we have reached out to them.
Reached out, but had not yet engaged.
Success, yep.
Do you need a contact with the baseball teams?
What's that?
Do you need a contact with the baseball team?
No, as part of the update, we'll share, we had a really good meeting with.
I just want to make.
Several.
I just want to make sure it's in the minutes that had not happened yet. Thanks. Who's taking minutes?
Any other issues
Melissa will be taking minutes.
Oh.
She's watching.
digitally?
She's watching. Okay.
I also
She'll take them
noticed,
later. It's gonna hold it up.
I also noticed in my chair report that I think this was, I think I had mentioned end of February for board applications, and it's on here end of March, and so that needs to be changed to end of February,
I think it's been confirmed that it is.
unless they've changed it.
I think they've changed it.
Oh, I just saw a notification from the city that's still posted at February
End of
29th.
this month. Okay, then it is the end of February. We'll confirm.
Since that's coming up here real soon.
Yes, it is.
Any other issues? If not, can I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I move to approve the minutes as revised.
Anyone like to second that?
I'll second.
All in favor of minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are approved. Thank you for that. Like we have any audience here tonight, so we're moving on quickly to, here you are, I was looking for you.
Oh, me? Okay. It's like, was there someone else?
Yeah.
Okay. Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. My name is Steven Pudua. I'm the Senior Transportation Planner for the City of Issaquah, and I'm here to talk about the Mobility Master Plan. Before I get started on that, I have an interactive presentation for you all tonight, so I'm going to ask that you bring out your smartphones if you have them, because I'll be collecting a lot of your feedback via this. I'll also be taking notes for those of you who don't have a smartphone, but this is actually really helpful as part of the discussion that we'll be having tonight as we walk through each of the policies that were outlined in your staff report that was provided to you. First question, to test this out, to make sure everybody's connected, go to menti.com on your smartphone. Once you're on that website, enter the code that's in the top right there, and that'll bring you straight to this presentation. Buddy, okay. And then if you're still connecting, we'll go through. Correct. Dancers Philadelphia back in 1925. That's when the original trolley was manufactured and eventually was shipped out to the Northwest, which is now the trolley that we use now. If you have questions, I don't have too many answers on it. The Issaquah Historical Society, they have a ton of information about it. It's actually really interesting. All right, so the last time we met, we talked last fall about potential policies that we should be considering related to transportation, but also consistent with a lot of the board's commission's goals in terms of the type of policies you discuss on a regular basis. And I'm not gonna spend too much time on this. The main thing to know is this is a summary of what we heard, and you'll get this presentation later so you can review it again. Most of the policies we're discussing tonight are in reaction and addressing a lot of these concerns that were told to us in our discussions last fall. Where we are in the project now is kind of in the tail end of developing all those policies, programs, and projects. We are now just confirming what we heard with a lot of you and making sure that we didn't miss anything in terms of like the type of policies that we should be considering. The next part of this project is going to be going to plan drafting, and as part of that, following that, there will be a review process that there will be another opportunity to comment on the mobility master plan. For the policies we'll discuss tonight, they are more specific to the type of projects we'll be developing as part of the mobility master plan, but also it'll help us identify the strategies that we'll be using to implement much of those projects. I don't have a ton of time with you tonight, so I'm gonna ask that I limit questions to 1 or 2 per policy and then save more time for policies at the end of the presentation. The first question or first policy I want to consider for you is committing to a Vision Zero goal. This is a goal that would eliminate traffic deaths and serious injuries related to collisions on Issaquah streets by 2040. Have many of you heard of a Vision Zero goal before? Some cities in our areas have adopted something like this. You may have heard of Target Zero that the state has adopted. That's more specific to our state roads and what's managed by the state. Each city and jurisdiction still has to adopt its own policy. We don't just fall under the state policy. Are there any questions related to this type of policy?
So where are you getting stats from on something like this?
So a lot of this is coming from collision data that is already collected by our police department, but also the state. Much of the reported collisions that go to them aren't really encompassing everything. And that's part of the Vision Zero goal, is actually trying to talk with emergency services and talking with hospitals and try to get a more accurate description of what the data actually should look like. Because right now, reported collisions isn't everything. It doesn't take into account the level of discomfort people have of being on the roadways. It doesn't take into account near misses in situations where you are almost hit, but something that actually happens quite often in certain areas of the city. And that's part of this vision, is actually taking a closer look at that and taking a more proactive approach to roadway safety. Because what we know in the industry now is that there's certain types of infrastructure designs that we can incorporate with our streets that we know have a higher statistic value of being high risk for people walking or riding or bike or trying to cross the street. And we know that we can take a more proactive approach and avoid those type of situations, or design streets a little bit differently so that people have a better chance of walking away from any situation they might come into. Yes.
Does this include pedestrian deaths?
Yes. Any other questions on this one?
So how do you, where do you draw the line on serious injuries, and how are you actually even establishing that? Because the initial report of an accident wouldn't necessarily include a lot of that information.
So collision reports actually categorize different types of collisions, and the state does, even particularly as part of their Target Zero goal, they are establishing what a serious injury is and what a serious injury isn't. And so we could follow very similar criteria, or we can establish our own. And so as part of this process, if we take on this goal, we would need to establish a lot of that criteria ourselves.
Do you-
Yes?
Do you know what the current rates of traffic deaths and serious injuries are?
In the city of Issaquah, at the moment, I don't. 2019 data is still being processed by the state, so once they're done with that, we'll get it from them, and I'll have a better answer on that. I'm gonna move on to the next policy, if that's okay. So the next one is prioritizing safety improvements at locations with a history of severe or fatal collisions. Now, the city is already doing this. Most cities do this already. They follow reported history of collisions to prioritize their investments, but it's never been actual policy of the city. It's never actually been written down in a transportation policy. It was just something we did. And so now we're actually putting it in detail, and it's something that's gonna be complementing the proactive approach, not just assuming we're gonna be avoiding these situations, but also looking at what the history is, things that we aren't really seeing, and being able to address those as well. This one's a little more straightforward, but are there any questions on this one? Okay. So for this policy, it's implementing Complete Streets principles to create a multimodal system for all users. The main thing to note with this is we already have a Complete Streets policy in city code, but it's a little dated, and we're actually in the process of updating it. What's new with this is actually saying, creating a multimodal system and creating it for all users. Two big concepts related to Complete Streets, because the original assumption was you would just put a bike lane and a sidewalk everywhere and you have a Complete Streets. But now we know you can't necessarily do that. And in going in the way of a context-based design system, you have to be a little more specific in terms of like what you install and where you install it. And so this is new in the way that we're gonna be doing Complete Streets for multimodal system, but for all users. Any questions on this one? I think one of the biggest questions I usually get about this is, if the city's already doing it, do we need a policy? And my typical response is yes, because if it's not a policy, we don't have anything to really hold ourselves accountable to it. We can say we're doing it, but we have no way of really saying, yes, we're doing it, and we're gauging ourselves based on this policy. And that's what the new policy is. So for this, the next two policies, it's related to the build out of the pedestrian network, and I have to explain it a little because it's a little more complicated than what it was before. And the reason for that is with a context-based design, we are trying to break it out into four different tier groups. And for the first group, it's more specific to high activity pedestrian areas where we say in all major streets we want to build out 5 to 10 feet of sidewalk on both sides of the street. And that's because of the demand. A lot of that is looking at that context of where the street's gonna be located, but also related to the demand. For tier 2, it's looking at 5-foot sidewalks on both sides of the streets near a lot of those high activities areas. So for tier 1, that's gonna be all central Issaquah, Old Town, the commercial area up in Highlands. Tier 2, it's gonna be a lot of those residential streets in that same area, but that aren't really those major streets that really call for or warrant sidewalk on both sides of the street, or 10-foot sidewalks on both sides of the street. And then for tier 3, it's a 5-foot sidewalk on one side of major streets in all other areas of the city. So outside central Issaquah, outside of Old Town and the commercial area in Highlands, all major streets will have at least a sidewalk on one side. And then for tier 4, for residential streets, it's looking more at a shared street approach, not necessarily saying that we're gonna build a sidewalk on one side, not excluding sidewalks if that is what the neighborhood's gonna need, but saying we're gonna be looking at a more shared street approach. And the reason for that is traditionally, when we looked at build out of walking network throughout the city, we just said, we're gonna build a sidewalk everywhere. That hasn't really been successful for us, but for most people who have said that over the years. And so we have to take a more prioritized approach of where we actually build sidewalk investments. And we're not gonna say, okay, we'll prioritize certain streets for sidewalks and everybody else is just on their own. It's saying everywhere else on their own, we're gonna do something different. And that's where the 20 mile per hour speed limit and a more shared street approach is looking at potential traffic calming. Maybe putting in different crossing improvements, maybe looking at other improvements that may make it more comfortable for people to walk and ride their bike while sharing the street with cars. And it's gonna be different depending on which neighborhood you're in. But it's to say that we're gonna try something different that we can afford and more realistically do in a 20-year time frame.
Is it, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna add, how do shared use routes or multi-purpose trails, some have been identified as 10 to 12 feet fit into this pedestrian network?
They would fall into the tier 1 side of things where you have the high pedestrian areas. And it's not to say it won't be included on the other areas of the city. Those are more corridor specific as we had to tier it for different areas of the city.
Okay.
So you'll still have those multimodal 10-foot trails through residential streets that are already identified in the park strategic plan. But in terms of everywhere else in that same neighborhood, it's gonna be looking at these different tiers.
Stephen, can I ask maybe a clarifying point as well? So the
Yes.
pedestrian network you're talking about with these 4 tiers are really, those definitions all look to me like they're on right of way.
Yes.
It's the on right of way pedestrian network.
Correct.
So how would we have an off right of way pedestrian network that will obviously want to talk to one another and integrate, correct?
Yes.
So, okay.
Yeah, and so it all falls into that whole context-based design. This is more specific to the on the right-of-way network,
Okay.
how we're gonna be designing it, but in the context of if it's connecting to an off right-of-way network,
Mhm.
we're gonna be designing specific to that.
Okay.
I would like to suggest that tier 1 be increased to 12 feet, because that's how it's written in the goals and policies of Park Strategic Plan for some of those multi-purpose trails, like the Mountains of Sound Trail.
Yep, okay,
So I would just make that slight edit.
okay.
With respect to new neighborhoods, I have a concern if we're not, I don't really know how this fits into development requirements or not, but, I have a concern if we're not requiring sidewalks on both sides of the street. So I live in Tallis, and on the main road going into Tallis, there's a sidewalk only on one side of the street. And it's a safety issue because people still use the other side of the street. And there's not there's no sidewalk there.
Right.
And they're not on the shoulder, they're on the street. And so if we're not requiring a developer to put in a sidewalk on both sides of the street, that's a major road, they won't do it.
Right.
And so that's my concern.
For the build-out of new developments and what we're connecting to, so for the example of Tallis, if there's gonna be continued development in that neighborhood, which there is, the requirement is gonna remain the same, that a sidewalk stay on one side. But this is saying is that for a lot of the pre-existing neighborhoods, we're not gonna just go out and build a sidewalk everywhere.
I understand. My concern is that for a new development, I think that it should actually be on both sides of the street. There's some funky little neighborhoods in Tallis as well where there's a sidewalk on this side of the street for 5 houses, and then it stops, and then you have to cross the street. If you want to stay on a sidewalk, you actually have to cross the street. There's no intersection. It's just like the middle of the street. And you get on the other side of the street to be on it. So if
Okay.
you're like pushing a baby in a stroller, or you're wanting your kids to walk on the sidewalk, they can't actually do it on one side of the street. So to me, the city should have a requirement that
Be on both sides.
it actually be on both sides for new development. I totally understand that for like existing development, it's more complicated than that. But
Got it, okay,
if you don't require it, it won't happen.
right. Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments on this one before I get to the policy? So this one is asking essentially the same question. Shall we provide pedestrian facilities based on context and nearby amenities? Do you find this important? Is it okay? Does the language need work? Oh, and one thing that I forgot to say is that I'm going to be following up this meeting with an additional questionnaire so I can get more details. Just because I don't have enough time to really have a deep dive discussion with you, I want to be able to give you the opportunity to provide more information.
Would it be beneficial, Stephen, as you go through this with other groups to maybe clarify on right-of-way pedestrian network?
Yeah. Thank you.
Are you meaning in this question, the pedestrian network that you showed just before?
Yes. For this next one, it's very similar question, but it's more specific to roadway crossings. Is the context of the location of where we're designing important? All right, for these next couple policies, I have to also explain it because it's specific to the bicycle network. An important concept to consider when we're talking about bicycle networks is there isn't just one type of bike rider out there. Who's seen this before, the different type of bike riders? Okay, so, good, this is actually interesting.
Maybe
Most
not
people,
specific like
most
this.
people assume that all the bike riders that are on the street is that 1%. The strong, fearless spandex warriors that you just see everywhere and go everywhere at any time, any point. But the truth of the matter is that when you really look at the different type of bike riders that are out on trails, in the roads, just out riding their bikes in our community, it can be broken up in this kind of way. Maybe not specifically in these percentages, this is kind of a general percentages based on region, but for Issaquah, it's gonna be very similar groups. The next group is gonna be enthusiastic and confidence, where, yeah, we ride the bike and we go to the grocery store and pick up something because there's a protected bike lane that takes me straight to the grocery store. The next group is interested and concerned, and the concerning part is that they don't feel comfortable or bike riding is inconvenient for the type of trips they want. And then there's the last group who's not gonna ride their bike regardless of what you do or say. That percentage also goes up and down depending on the area that you go to, depending on culture and infrastructure you have in place. This is important because this is the context that we're considering for building out the bike network. It's not just building out a network based on land use, it's also looking at the different types of users. So for this first question on policy, should we build out the citywide bike network specific to the enthusiastic and the confident to ride their bike more? And I can go back to the last one if that helps with clarifying this question.
So if we disagree, we say I'm unsure.
Yeah.
And you were estimating the enthusiastic and confident at, is that the 33% or the 60?
It's the
7%.
7%.
Oh, okay.
So it's really for the 7% plus the strong and fearless who will use it regardless of what we build.
Oh, okay.
Stephen, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes,
on this
please.
one? Where I work, we were talking a lot about e-bikes and the way that that's exploding and really taking off, especially in hilly areas. So, future forecasting into how many people are gonna change that 7%. A lot of the people in that 30 are probably gonna move in the next 5 to 10 years. Have you been thinking about that in your future forecasts? I was just curious how that might adjust that 1.7.
E-bikes is actually changing the game quite a bit. So for, one of the biggest issues that all the boards and commissions brought up was topography in Issaquah. And e-bikes for communities like Issaquah really changes how people approach or view bicycling as a travel option. Because most of the time people, they hate the idea of having to ride their bike to the grocery store if you live up in Tallis.
Never gonna happen.
Exactly. But if you have an e-bike that basically carries you most of the way and you barely break a sweat making that trip, you might consider it for more of those situations. I'm not saying you'll do it, but it's more of on the positive end of, yeah, I could consider that. Because it does make that trip a little bit easier, and you have facilities that you could use to make the trip.
The data we're seeing is when people buy an e-bike, typically right now, because they're early adopters, they're, already biking somewhat, but they bike about 7 to 8 times more than they previously did just on their regular bike. So we're seeing a huge increase, even from people who are already riding their bikes quite a bit, so.
Yeah. And a lot of that percentage is in terms of like number of trips, is people making trips to the grocery store that's within 3 miles from their house when they used to drive. And because it's such a short trip, it's nice and convenient for them now. So the next one is looking more specific to high activity areas that will be designed in the bicycle facilities, designed for the higher level of comfort. To encourage people who are interested but concerned. So it's looking at that bigger percentage. And the reason why we're looking at the more high activity centers for that design specific or level of comfort is because those areas are actually designed to really encourage this activity. We want to design these areas where kids feel comfortable riding around in the area, because you're going to have a lot more of that. These are higher density areas where people are going to be walking more, riding their bike more, encouraged to use transit more. And if they're not comfortable, if kids aren't comfortable really using that area, you're basically creating a desert for kids to never go outside. And so that's why we're being this specific on bicycle facilities in these areas.
Are you guys in process of mapping these areas, Stephen?
Yes.
The high activity areas, et cetera?
Yeah. Yeah, so.
I'd be curious how that correlates to one of our topics tonight in terms of the creek corridor, right, this north-south.
Our consultant has been instructed to line up our facilities with Park Strategic Plan
Okay.
facilities, so everything should line up. For this next policy, it's a little more straightforward, but it's important that we address access or address transit services as a policy, and I want to get your ideas on, is this important to you? Is there something that we should be considering? And that's from your perspective as a resident, but also as a park board member.
I'm not sure that I understand
Sure.
what this means, so.
Similar to the walking and biking facilities, only certain areas warrant different type of facilities. So for this, for transit services, maybe we look at rerouting certain services so that it complements certain areas of the city. So areas either higher density, parks, areas that warrant where you have different levels of pedestrian activity that support transit service itself, which is important, but also supports the context of the land use itself too.
So the land, does that mean just like commercial or kind of like parkland use, or also like residential that is like multifamily, high density?
Anything where you'll see a lot higher pedestrian activity on the right of way or on the streets. So parkland would be with multifamily housing, commercial areas are all fit in that category. For this next one, it's more specific to access to transit. And the difference to that is how we get to transit versus the transit services themselves. And one thing that we never really outlined but talked about was making sure that we're integrating our walking and biking network specific to how we're designing our transit network as well. So making sure our walking and biking network leads specifically to our transit facilities. That's something that everyone assumes that we do or have done, and it's not true in all instances. So we wanted to have this policy to make sure that we're being held accountable to it. Any questions on this one? Okay.
Do you have a separate policy that approaches maximizing transit use by going into neighborhoods that don't have transit?
Yes, but that'll be a different policy that we'll have in the master plan. But it won't be, it's not gonna be called fixed transit services. It's be something similar to flexible transit services. So it's gonna be looking more at partnerships with different transportation companies to help get access from the neighborhoods out to the major transit centers or different transit facilities. So maybe it's a partnership with Uber and Lyft where there's subsidized rides from your houses out to Issaquah Transit Center. Or maybe it's a partnership with another transportation agency that provides shuttle services through neighborhoods. It's any of those type of options that we can explore. For this next policy, it's more specific to the use of our multimodal system, but making sure that we're making the use of our roadways more efficient. And it's important that we look at intelligent transportation systems related to our signals, because that can actually help move the efficiency, not just of cars, but also people going through the intersections. It also plays a very important role in terms of improving the safety of people crossing the street as well. Any questions on this one?
So, I guess my question is, in a crosswalk, you're gonna delay cars turning and letting people get across the street 2 or 3 seconds before the light for cars to turn, or I guess I don't quite understand that this is, or is it like the bus signals here where the buses get to go before everybody else?
That's one of the things that you can do to help improve visibility of pedestrians, so they get like a second to go out into the roadway before cars are allowed to potentially turn. But it's not always that. It's more of looking at an adaptive system so that the system is actually able to track all the cars going through, the buses going through, large vehicles going through, how often people are crossing the street in certain directions, and actually prepare the lighting system for something like that. So it's actually being more efficient on how it's allowing certain movements go through the intersection. The next one is actually related to your question on auto delay. So related to Vision Zero and the prioritization of safety for people using the streets, should we be prioritizing the safety of pedestrians and bicyclists in intersections regardless of potential impact on auto delay? And this is an important question because it's never really been discussed openly. And that's why we want to have these conversations. Is I want to hear your feedback on something like this, because right now we have conflicting policies of we want to maximize auto movement through intersections, but we also want to maximize the safety of people in the city. And right now they're in conflict because what we know is if you maximize the safety of people through intersections, it potentially has an impact on auto delay. It doesn't always, but in most instances it does. Any comments or questions on this one?
I just think somebody that's in a hurry is gonna forget about being courteous. Sorry.
No, that's an important comment, because I hear it a lot. And there are things we have to do to try to change travel behavior, but there are ways for us to control travel behavior too, in terms of restricting right turns at certain intersections, or restricting left turns at certain intersections. And so there are steps we can take to help control some of this. Some of it's gonna take extra enforcement by police departments, something that we're gonna have to coordinate with them and work with them on policies like this.
Is this going to be in any areas where they have the flag, so people can pick up a flag and walk across the street? Or is this just pretty much for signals?
This is primarily for signals. The question about the crossings and context, that would probably be where we look at potential flags for crossings or other types of tools for other crossings.
With the new law going on at the Gilman Lofts, the scramble, where proposed
Yes.
scrambles, that would be considered one of these?
Yes.
Is that when you can cross all directions?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
so
a
all
super
traffic's-
efficient way to move a lot of people.
Yep.
And then just stop.
Yeah, they'll
Stop
be going
it.
in at the Three Trails crossing.
Yeah.
Where Gilman Trail, East Lake Sam, and Pickering Trail all meet, or the Rainier Trail.
East Lake Sammamish Trail and Rainier Trail.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would think
become
like
one.
Front Street and Sunset would be another, or Sunset. Yeah, it would be another good place for that, something like that.
For this next policy is related to parking. Should the city be taking a more proactive approach with managing public parking, particularly in high-activity pedestrian areas of the city, to improve availability? This is direct response to what we heard from, I believe, from this board, but most of the boards and commissions on the near-term demand for parking. There's a huge demand for parking that the city needs to address. And so this is gonna be taking a more proactive approach of looking at what kind of efficiency improvements we can be making, at least in the short term. In the long term, maybe it means building a parking facility in certain areas, but we don't know, particularly because parking structures are very expensive. And even just a surface parking lot are still very expensive. In my last jurisdiction I worked, we built a 64 stall surface parking lot that cost $900,000. They're not cheap in any way. And the reason for that is there's a lot of environmental concerns related to having surface parking lots. You have to meet certain requirements when in terms of like the type of materials you have to use. And the costs just add up. And so we have to look at efficiency of parking availability versus kind of the capacity of it. Not saying capacity won't be considered, just more of it won't be the only option. Any questions on this one?
I mean, I think we spoke about this in a recent park board meeting too. Like there's definitely some stressors, I think, in some areas of our community that, like I suspect that people are coming in and parking all day and using transit in areas that aren't designed to be doing that. And so especially back behind Veterans Memorial Field and, you know, off Front Street, it's really hard to find parking. And I would love to see that be, you know, like 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hour, you know, kind of parking, so you know that people aren't using it for commuter parking.
Right. Yeah.
Has the city considered at all, like, doing metered parking or anything either to raise money in order to, like, build more parking?
The city has looked at that. There was a parking study that was done last year that looked at Highlands, Old Town, Front Street, and I think some areas of Central, but I think it was mostly Old Town and Highlands. And they did look at a lot of those options. I don't know, I'll have to look at what the study concluded.
Yeah.
But either option that we were gonna consider was gonna take a lot of investment, whether it's.
Yes, investment in, like.
Investment in,
Somehow.
because when you put out a timed parking place, not just meters, but if you put 2 hour or 4 hour limits on parking spaces, you have to have somebody enforce it. We currently don't have the capacity on the police department to do that. So that would look at potentially either contracting with a third-party service, or that's looking at hiring parking enforcement officers for ourselves. And that's something, both take huge investments from the city to be able to do that, to operate it and to maintain it. And we currently don't have anybody on staff designated to even manage a system like that. So it's another thing you have to consider as part of doing something like that.
So what's more economical along those lines, staffing or meters?
Depends. Depends on where the revenue for both go to.
You have to staff to meter, don't you?
Exactly. Most cities who have, let's say, a third-party vendor or parking enforcement officers, most of that staffing or that support is funded by the ticketing or by the meters. That's one or the other. Meters usually represent a smaller percentage, surprisingly. It's usually the ticket violations that support the majority of staffing for metering and managing the system. So it's kind of a careful consideration the city has to make. It's not an easy overnight kind of change we can kind of make, but it's something that we have to think really thoroughly about.
And I think your point too, Stephen, that either one represents an investment.
Correct.
There's an initial investment, a capital investment the city needs to make, in either of those options, but good to be exploring them.
Right.
Are those the options that you mean when you say the proactive approach, or are there others?
Yeah.
I'm the outlier. I think I would prefer we try to get more people on bikes and walking and improve the walkability than building parking lots and ticketing people, so.
Yes.
Prefer we spend our money there.
I'm all about giving people more
That's
options
proactive.
to get around. Right. Any other questions before I move on to this one? Okay.
Yeah, as a counterpoint to that, I'm not all about ticketing people either, but I think that if we are able to open up some parking spaces, it'll help all the businesses on Front Street and people to go to the park and all that kind of stuff. Because a lot of times you just end up driving through and I drive through, I can't find anywhere to park, so
Right.
I go somewhere else that, has a lot. So I'm sure I'm not the only one.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of different people have different opinions, particularly
Yeah.
when it comes to parking. So that's why you have to take such a careful approach to managing it. This last question that I have actually wasn't in your staff report. It was something that, my fault, wasn't added to your staff report, but is an important question that we have on how the city is going to be addressing climate change. And the question or the policy is looking at incorporating the greenhouse gas emissions into the evaluation and selection of mobility investments, something that we traditionally and conventionally haven't done. So the question is this important to actually do that now?
Can you give an example of how, what that?
Sure. Let's say we look at greenhouse gas emissions and look at the type of projects that might reduce greenhouse gas emissions. One would be increasing the number of people riding bikes, increase the number of people walking or using transit. So projects that boost a lot of those type of ridership will get higher score, essentially, when either picking or prioritizing a project.
Okay, so for the example you gave earlier about the different options of maybe getting people to transit from neighborhoods that aren't connected, that would prioritize having a shuttle that might pick up a bunch of people rather than Uber
Right.
subsidies, which
Yeah.
is just replacing
Yeah.
another car with my car.
Exactly. Yeah. How can we move the most amount of people or goods, and at the same time reduce the amount of emissions coming out of that situation or trip? That's essentially how you have to look at it. Any questions on this one? I think that's it for me. Any follow-up questions on all of it or anything specific?
So what kind of a timeline are you looking at to actually have the plan done?
Let's see if I can go back to the beginning. There we go. We're looking to have the plan adopted by September. There's some deadlines we have to meet with, meeting with council, discussing a lot of these policies, starting in next month, actually. And so we'll be kind of working through that process. So discussing a lot of the policies, how to prioritize projects, and then coming up and discussing a prioritized list of projects through the drafting of the plan. And once we have that draft available, then we'll go out to the boards and commissions again and say, here's that draft plan, here's it all laid out based on what we discussed. Are we missing anything? Is there anything that we might have misheard? Okay. And that'll be around July when we come back out.
I really appreciate these updates, Stephen, and
Mhm.
from my memory, this takes me back to our 2-year process of our park strategic plan, right? And I think the numerous touches and really in the end, this macro level goal that we had for what does a unified system look like, and I
Yeah.
think in a lot of ways, that's the elevation that you're trying to achieve with this, right? With,
Mhm.
looking at all mobility throughout the
Yeah.
city.
And it's
Big
tricky.
endeavor, big endeavor.
It is. It's fairly complicated because we have so many planning documents talking about transportation. And one of the biggest goals, a part of this project, was trying to consolidate and bring it all in and not have someone refer to, Title 18 for something transportation policy, and then also the walk and roll plan, and also a parking study. So it was really trying to bring it all in so that we refer to one guiding document related to transportation and mobility, related to how you guys tackled the park strategic plan. So I think it's really important.
And this board really was the steering committee that helped to shepherd that. I
Mhm.
know you've got a board working with you on that
Mhm.
work as well. So.
Yeah.
So when and how do cost factors get entered into all of this?
That'll be May, June. Once we've got an idea, more feedback from council on the prioritization of investments, we'll have a better idea of where to actually apply costs and timing for implementation. Because one of the things is the project list we're generating is really a consolidation of all project lists. So it's a really long list. So we don't really want to have our consultants spend time pricing all of them. We want a certain number that we're really gonna be implementing over the next 5 to 10 years, that we really wanna have cost estimates and timing for.
And I don't know a lot about transportation planning.
Mhm.
Where are all the funding opportunities for this kind of thing?
There's federal grant opportunities, a lot of state grant opportunities. With Complete Streets in particular, having our own Complete Streets policy makes us eligible for an award program the state has that can give us either $500 to $1 million for funding pretty much any related project to Complete Streets. There's federal grants related to improving access to transit. There's partnerships we can go on with Metro and Sound Transit to either build structure or have some type of partnership to increase access to transit facilities or improve a transit facility. There's a lot of different options depending on what you want to do.
I know, like a kind of a big unknown with our park strategic plan was sort of where the light rail station will be placed and sort of how, because it was important to us that we'd be able to connect to it and
Right.
connect, and I'm assuming you're kind of dealing with the same questions.
I would
and-
love to answer that question.
Yeah.
Because it would make a
Because
little.
it's hard to put a
Yes.
placeholder
Yes,
somewhere.
it
right?
is.
Do you have an idea to timing?
Timing on that, next year, we're gonna be taking on developing a transit plan. We're hoping to have that answered before then.
Yeah,
So we're looking at having some transit-related discussions this year to help lead into development of that transit plan, but there's no timeline on that yet. It's still kind of a process in development.
and are you doing anything with coordinating with other jurisdictions to kind of, because Issaquah seems to be the first point of mass transit for a lot of our neighboring communities.
Mhm.
So people drive to Issaquah Park and then, have to take the bus back to Issaquah and then they're like filling our surface streets.
Mhm.
Are you coordinating at all with, or as part of this project, coordinating with other jurisdictions to maybe get some more transit centers, a little bit
Yes.
farther out?
Yeah, so part of the data evaluation for this was looking at regional travel behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so we collected a lot of information of where people are traveling from in and out of the city. So that's gonna help us prioritize a lot of those type of partnerships and talking with,
Okay.
hey, City Sammamish, where we notice a good percentage of people going to this transit center are coming from your city. let's talk about then, meet with Metro, see if we can figure something out. So yes, to
Okay,
answer your
great.
question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Great, thank you for having me.
Thank you,
Thank you.
appreciate it.
So I'll follow up with an email on kind of a follow-up questionnaire that you can provide a lot more detail than this could. Thank you.
So the city's gonna have to buy me a smartphone if we're gonna continue with these kind of phones. It'll be easier.
Yeah, good call. Good call.
Okay, so I think next it's Jeff, you and Jennifer are gonna give us Anchor Park update.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't I kick that off? Looking at time, we're doing okay.
Yep.
We'll be as efficient as we can and certainly save time for Q&A. I thought I'd kick this off with a thank you. I know we had a chance to talk briefly last month about the goals and vision statements. As we shared with you that last meeting, we were going to be again shaping concepts and begin ideally getting a survey out and kicking off the next phase of engagement here this month. So we're back reporting to you. We had a chance to share with City Council last Tuesday, the 18th. Provided them an update with the work that we've been working on with you and an initial look at concepts. Tonight, our intent, as you looked at the PowerPoint presentation, a lot of what you're seeing tonight is similar to what was shared with the council. I think, like I shared with council, this project represents a transition period we're in, and that we're really coming off of phase one engagement. Phase one engagement, if you recall, was really about looking at these three parks holistically. We're now with these concepts and beginning to go into more site-specific conversation, really kicking off phase two, which is really where a lot of the work is going to be and a lot more site-specific. I want to turn the slide, Jen, thank you. This is a slide I shared with City Council. Don't really need to dive deep into this, but just a reminder and really talking about our anchor document, that being the Park Strategic Plan, just as we were talking with Stephen about, and that this plan is really what shapes our priorities and our work. Some of what we heard through this process was, let's make sure we take care of what we have. Let's modernize and make sure our current parks really support our needs. It was a lot of our theme of placemaking. Let's make sure our system connects and better connects. I think a lot of what has led to our creek corridor. In a lot of ways, this plan really helped us to identify, if you recall last summer, these three parks that we've launched this effort on really being the foundational parks within our city system, and in particular the Valley system. And those three parks being Tibbetts Valley Park, and really being an anchor not only to what it is historically, but an anchor to where Central Issaquah and all that planning work has. That neighborhood of that park will be changing in future years. Veterans Memorial Park being the next anchor, and really its history and its place and connection to Old Town and support of Old Town, both as a neighborhood but also Front Street as a commercial area. And then the third foundation anchor being the creek corridor. This idea of taking these years of acquisitions that the city has bought both along the creek and through really the heart of the city and unifying it and connecting it. This work, what I reminded council, its intent is for us to really be forward-thinking, to begin taking the long view for this site-specific work and for these projects, The idea being, we're really creating a vision with the community to understand that future investments, and those future investments will likely be a mix of large and small investments. Regardless of the size of those investments, we'll be moving towards this intended vision, as opposed to, I think sometimes we've heard in the past, as we've made small investments in certain parks, well, how does that fit? How does that fit into the big picture? This really allows us to have that big picture for these three spaces, and really be proactive rather than reactive. Another slide we shared, next slide, Jen, thank you, sorry.
I got it, I was just slow.
No, it's all good. Ding! No, sorry, my cold was really showing there. Next steps, and like I said, we're really transitioning to some next phases of engagement. I just wanted to share this with you before handing it off to Jennifer to talk through and walk through these concepts and really what the intention of this survey is. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, and I think going from this phase of engagement where we were looking at all three parks collectively and the relationships they have, we're now really going to be entering into more of a park-by-park approach to these. The information we intend to get back from these surveys really will allow us to explore what the community feels about opportunities, what the community feels about program ideas, trade-offs that we're going to have to really work through, competing preferences, likes and dislikes, all this survey feedback, and work with you as a steering group will really help us to work towards a better informed preferred concept, and the consultant team will likely be doing this through the spring and summer in probably more of a park-by-park approach, whereas I think as the survey feedback comes back, really prioritizing what park do we want to look at first, and probably in different park board meetings, whereas leading up to this, we've sort of talked about all three in the same meeting. We're going to be reaching a point where we'll probably want to do one park per meeting as we really begin to dive into this. I can say that our goal has been to complete this work by the end of this year, but I think given the enthusiasm we heard from council in their response to the update we gave them, I think the enthusiasm we hear from the community, and I think the desire to really look at a vast array of differing priorities that these parks have, this very well could go into 2021. It could go into next year, and I think I don't want to feel like we're so beholden to this schedule that we feel like we're rushing this work. I think it's important that we really allow all these phases to play themselves out. Phase one, engagement. You're all familiar with what that was. Next slide. Sorry, I need to say bing. Lots of responses, lots of different enthusiastic support, like I shared. That response, that survey response, the feedback we heard as we studied that and worked through that with you, I think it really reiterated and echoed a lot of the park plan and this idea of let's reinvest in what we have, let's have what we have be more diverse and address more needs. Let's connect what we have better. Engagement, I won't go through each of these, but as you see throughout the last several months, we have engaged with many different partners, many different interest groups. I think what's going to be important as we go through these next phases of engagement that we continue those conversations, those relationships into the next phases. I think the next slide jumps into the actual
Just
parks
with
themselves.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
With respect to that
Yeah.
slide, I just want, just for the benefit of people here, that the sports teams' engagement in August and in January, neither of those included Issaquah Little League or Issaquah Baseball Club or the high school age teams that are based in Issaquah and filled by Issaquah families. So that was a big gap. There are six of the city owns 9 baseball fields, and 6 of them are on these 2 properties, so Veterans Memorial and Tibbetts. So, from my perspective, it's really disappointing that didn't occur. And I know we have the contacts now, and it was a gap in contacts, but I wish someone had said, I wonder why they're not showing up, in August.
No, I
And we-
appreciate
we-
that,
we
Dan.
could've-
Yeah, I know, I appreciate that, I appreciate that honesty, and I know it was expressed at the last meeting. I know we had a chance to meet with groups here a couple weeks ago. I really appreciate your assistance in that, and appreciate the feedback we heard from those groups, and baseball-specific groups.
Yep.
And certainly, like I said, remain committed to, as we're now just really starting to get into some site-specific work, the engagement with them, the engagement with the other sports groups, and the other very interested parties and partners will be critical.
Yep. Yep.
So with that, Jen, do you want to tour us on sort of a park by park?
Sure.
And again, I think we'll try and be real careful of time, knowing we've got some other things. Just a suggestion, up to you as a board, but maybe after each site, maybe we have a Q&A if you want to do that, or Jen can quickly drive through all 3 and we save it all for Q&A, whatever your pleasure is.
All right, well, let me know as we get rolling.
Yeah.
So, as you may recall, last month at Park Board, we went through this very slide talking about the feedback we've heard to date for Tibbetts Valley Park and what some of the themes were, the priorities and program elements the community has hoped to receive. Again, we received hundreds of responses through our engagement processes, and some of those opinions are also conflicting. Should it be at Tibbetts Valley Park? Should it be at Veterans Memorial? Should it be here or there? So these concepts are really meant to identify some differences within each of the parks, different opportunities, potentials, and really, when we send out the community survey, get some feedback as to what's sitting well with the community, what's resounding with them. We've heard different things for different parks. So for Tibbetts, just real quick, some of the themes were to improve and diversify the sports fields for all season use, expand types of program activities, make the creek an accessible feature, connect to the new dog park, include programs that support future urban growth and quality of life, add activities and adjacent to the sports field for all ages, maintain and develop natural areas for active and passive recreation, and a loop around the whole trail. Programs to include different sports fields, play, skate park, plaza, public garden, kiosk pavilion, open lawns, and some hardcourt areas, as well as natural area access. This first concept is the crossroads, and this one is really meant to be a connection to the central Issaquah plan along Newport Way. Newport Way is the edge of central Issaquah, so up in this area there's gonna, and north into the valley floor is gonna be more dense living. So this concept proposal really allows for more penetration along the Newport edge, welcoming, creating different uses and activities while concentrating all the sports uses in the center, demonstrating connection to the proposed dog park and parking on both sides, as well as perhaps enhancing and expanding a future skate park to provide further connection. Also creating an amphitheater with additional trails connecting throughout the park. One thing we heard, some people didn't even know there was the park here. Some common themes or the creek, not a park. Did I say park? Sorry. It's getting late. So with this concept, and you'll see in all Tibbetts Valley Park concepts, is we've addressed the various types of sports field uses, parking in various manners, as well as some options for what to do with the manor house. And when we go out to the community with some of the survey questions, we're gonna be posing some opportunities for people to further comment and discussion on these. So these surveys are really meant to evoke and elicit more feedback to further help refine and define what it is we've heard today.
And Jen, I'm sorry if I interject real quick.
Yeah.
I should have emphasized this. These are really intended to be concepts. These are not designs. These are not at a level of specificity. It really is more about programmatic connections.
Yeah.
There is, on the consultant team, I mean, the fields, for example, these are not design fields, but these are certainly fields that have a certain size. The survey is intended to note what the sizes of those fields would be, both soccer, lacrosse, but also baseball, softball, in terms of just giving a sense of scale. I know that was something that we've talked about with the baseball group and heard from some of the other sports groups. So though not a design, we're trying to find that sweet spot in these concepts of size and scale, but not design elements.
Right. Right now, it's more spatial planning, adjacency to programming. As you'll see here, most of the programming for additional stuff outside of the sports field programs are all along Newport Way. Some of the other options, you'll see them in different locations. So with that, we'll quick. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I just need to make sure, otherwise if I don't say it when I see this, I'm gonna kick myself later. Couple things, just from a baseball perspective. It's really nice when you're at tournaments or have multiple kids in the sports to have, there's a reason they design it with all the fields and the outfields going out and have the key, which we don't see here. It also looks like there's 3 fields versus I believe the 6 that they currently have. So 5 at that field. Five. So I would just be remiss if I saw this, even though it's concept, to say like, these parks are, those baseball fields are busy. Like, there's not space to lose 2 fields.
It's not that often that all 5 are being used at the same time.
It's nice to have that one for free play. So, like, what's nice is that one that's back in the corner, kids can go play on that one, it's not usually programmed.
Yeah, and this is gonna be one of the, and you'll see in the concepts, different baseball alignments and configurations, and that is a great point. And I think it's one of the conversation pieces that we'll want to have as part of this survey is when we look at reimagining Tibbetts Valley Park, reinvesting in Tibbetts Valley Park, the current configuration of fitting 5 baseball fields on here still probably does not allow for bringing in a diversity of new park elements into the park, right? So it becomes one of those competing pressures that we'll really want to, I think, get some feedback from the community. And then as we really get site-specific about Tibbetts Valley Park, that's probably going to be one of the big things we'll need to wrestle with is if we want to aspire to keeping 5 baseball fields there, we'll probably have to give something up on the other end in terms of what else that park can become. And I'm not the one to answer that, right? I'm the one to, I think, try and shepherd and facilitate the conversation, but it'll be a really important one.
And I would like to just throw out that if you're going from 5 to 3, the 3 should be, in my view, should be able to be like they should be the right size to be able to accommodate the right group so that fill the gaps in our system and also be able to really be used. Like when I look, and I guess we aren't supposed to get into details, but it's a turf field. If you don't have outfield fencing, a situation like this is completely worthless for older kids because the balls on a turf field, just like a ground ball becomes a home run.
So,
Okay.
so I think you'll
And
see.
so what you could say is you could put temporary fencing in, right? We're on year 3, coming up on year 3 at our Central Park turf field, and we don't have temporary fencing there. So I don't want to, I'm very, very nervous about doing anything that where the first thing to be cut is likely to be, you know, budget-wise, it's the fencing that can come later. You know, and have a design where you actually really need it, so.
So again, concepts intended
Yeah.
to share different
Elicit
ideas.
feedback.
I think you'll see.
I do
one of
have
the
one
other
question too on
concepts.
all these fields. Can I assume that for the turf part, that these are all turf, and that there will be some sort of fence around the entirety of that turf area?
Yeah.
Because
We-
that's
we haven't
that's
gotten to that
normally,
level
but
of detail.
well, I know you don't have it, but that would be an assumption that I would have would be because most jurisdictions that have a turf field have a fence around it. Okay, because I think that that's important to think about too. This
Most
becomes.
areas, but also probably some of the plaza areas, we'd want, much like Central Park Pad 1, right? Where we
Yeah.
want that open area where we want it to feel inviting and open for drop-in use as opposed to closed off and
Right.
restricted.
Yeah.
So probably, yeah, some mix.
Yeah, and that's a level of detail that we'll get into further down the road once we kind of hone in on a preferred concept, because we'll have to remember all these concepts and we go out for a survey. We'll elicit a whole bunch of feedback that we'll then have to digest into a preferred concept that may likely look like none of these that we're promoting, or may look highly similar to some of these. We won't know until we get.
Is there
the
any
feedback.
chance of it getting I mean, my gut reaction is that there's no way we would ever be able to put a light in on Highway 900, State Route 900, which is where that car access is right there, which is really close to the, it's closer to the intersection than where the Manor driveway is. That would be, to me,
That would
like a
require further
non-starter.
study to see what
Yeah.
kind of entrance, because it could be a right-in, right-out only, it could be some other possibilities.
Yeah.
Well,
Be
that
problematic.
certainly warrants further traffic study as
Yeah.
we get down the
well,
road.
that would be,
but-
that's a flag for me on this one.
And there'll be a lot, there's several opportunities
Yeah.
within the survey to add differing, additional comments. So that would certainly be one that would be great to add in on a comment. So just to kind of keep with a mind to time here, in the survey, we'll also be showing some of the precedent images to help evoke some concepts as to what it might look like. The amphitheater shown over along the creek, what an urban edge might look like for a gathering space and some penetration off of Newport Way, what a pavilion for some gathering space would be, and how a manor could be renovated to provide additional works. I'm going to keep going. This is from one perspective, what it might look like as you are walking through the space, to help people kind of imagine, because some people have a hard time reading plan view, what it might feel like to be in that space. The next concept is the promenade concept. And this one is really taking all the new amenities that before in the Crossroads concept were all up along Newport, are now honed in on a very wide gathering space that divides the sports fields here. So all those activities, really you have a focused access now from SR 900 Newport intersection and this strong spine that connects through the park. We still have parking on both sides of the park here, and differing baseball fields, as well as a grass area and some public gardens and some other hardcourt sports. Again, some additional loop trails in and around the creek area, and some revamping of the Manor House. There's also, you may see kiosks in some of these concepts, and some other plaza spaces for gathering.
This athletic field concept takes a little bit more of a baseball-centric perspective than the other one, but again, just a variety of ways to try and show programmatically how to create variety, but or multi-use, but also recognize some of the constraints that happen to that park in terms of athletic fields as we try and add other elements to
So Jeff, I would love to see this, I know that this got revised a little bit after we
Mhm.
spoke, but, I would still love to see this option have those fields, those multi-purpose fields, or like the soccer, lacrosse fields, flipped so they're within the outfield. Eastlake High School does that, Woodinville High School does that, the, Cold Creek ball fields do that. There's a bunch, most turf fields that are like actual baseball fields, they do it on a diagonal. And that would allow us to show an option where there was actually an outfield and it stopped. And it would allow all that extra space outside of those baseball fields to be grass or used for a different programmatic manner. I don't know why they have the field, like don't show that layout in any of these options, but that's what other jurisdictions are doing. And they might have to be like the modified size
Right,
soccer
smaller-
fields or
it's a
whatever,
smaller
like the
size
smaller
given
ones,
that
but
outfield,
that's
yeah.
like, that's an actual useful size for a particular age group, so.
And then here are just some of what the concept images, here is showing one of those, like what the spine would be with a multi-use activity corridor, what that would look like, what some play and some outdoor creek areas might look like, as well as a revised manner. And again, here's a sketch looking down what would be the active spine of the park and what it might be for kids to play on and families to gather as you've got children playing on fields or playgrounds within the park space. The next one is the creek weave concept, and this one is really focuses all of the areas that were in the promenade or the Newport Way, really focuses them more along the creek's edge. For engagement, allowing the sports fields to really take up the center of the field. This field layout is actually the most resembled of what is existing now out on site, utilizing these center spaces. There are some additional sport court reorientations, but this also allows the creek in times of flood to perhaps flood over in this area versus over and through the field. So this could actually have a very big storm component to it, which some of the other concepts don't show in this fashion, but certainly would be considered in further design as far as the functionality. But again, we still have some plaza and some creek overlook areas and some trails in a revamped manner, and further connections throughout the park. And you can see there's a walking loop out and around.
And this one has a parking garage, right?
Mhm. Oh, yes, this one, excuse me, thank you for pointing that out, Danielle. All the other concepts maintain this parking over on the Newport Way and SR 900 corner. This one does remove that and assumes that there would be a stacked or a parking structure over on this side. The hillside and access actually accommodates for some of that, and there could be, sorry. I'm moving things. And this really could be a very cool use within the park space and actually provide some additional usable areas.
And this one also adds a community building, I think, next to that parking garage too, which is different.
Yeah, so a community building would be used for gatherings or other activities, meeting space, whatever would need to be used for a meeting room or gathering space. Yep.
Looks like it has a splash pad too, huh?
Yep.
Yeah, these concepts are trying to show a variety of ideas, likely, and again, how the survey would be framed. We wouldn't be asking, you have to pick one of these three concepts. So it's really, I think we're gonna garner likes, dislikes from all of these concepts that will really help to, I think, probably start to pull ideas from each of them, preferred ideas from each of them into a preferred concept.
And here's what some of those images might look like as far as a floodable stormwater garden and some multi-use trails throughout the area and the creek overlook.
What does a floodable stormwater area look like when it's like dry, like in,
Like
in the
this right
summer.
now, so you've got some wet areas within there, if it's totally dry, these could be garden spaces, with trails in and around, and as the waters flow, they fill up with a varying elevation.
Probably planted with grasses or other plants, right, that are
Mhm.
suitable to
Yep.
being flooded.
being flooded
Yeah.
on occasion, yeah.
But can also handle being dry in the drier seasons.
Yeah.
The rain garden out and behind Pad 1 actually functions that way. So in periods of high water or heavy rain, because the whole field flows into that, it gathers and filters the water that comes off.
What are you talking about?
Back behind the.
Central Park.
At Central Park?
Central Park.
Yeah, Pad 1. There's a big new constructed rain garden that was built as part of the project, and that functions very much like these would.
One of the premises of this concept was really hearing from the community, what? Tibbetts Creek is in Tibbetts Valley Park, right? So
How can we go and enjoy the
how
creek?
might the creek become more of a element of this park?
Mhm. And focus the activities more along it. And then here's what a sketch might look like of what the park space could feel like. And then real quick, getting into Veterans Memorial, again, some of the themes were play, stronger connection to the senior center, maintain the multi-use green and honoring of the veterans, all seasons use, a way to stroll around, improving connections on the west side, potentially adding or changing parking. How do we connect to the depot park? And really gardens came out as a big one for this space, with plants being a destination. So some of the program elements that tried to get incorporated into the concepts include play, field, open green, memorial, strolling, splash, community gardens, park center, civic plaza, planting gardens, hardcourt spaces, commercial space, really connecting to the existing commercial spaces around the area, as well as further connection to the train depot and the museum there.
Jen, as you're transitioning to that first one, can I just, you can go to the first concept, sorry, just to emphasize something we shared with the council, and I think Deb from Methuen did a nice job of emphasizing it, is, and this goes for Tibbetts as well, but part of what we're trying to weave in to these concepts, to these ideas, and to the survey is the art of storytelling, and the art and history, and how do we take advantage of all three of these anchor spaces. So these two parks and the creek corridor, and while we're putting a vision on what we want them to be recreationally, we're also paying attention to how art, how celebrating our history can be part of placemaking. And there's an artist who's on the design team, Don Fells, who's done some initial work for Art Commission and also some initial work for us in Parks. He's part of this team, and that will be some key questions being asked in the survey. And again, now as we're going into phase 2 and starting to think more site specifically, it'll be pretty, I think it'll be pretty exciting. Maybe I'm showing my bachelor's degree in history, but part of placemaking is, a big part of placemaking is all these spaces have a story to tell in the history of Issaquah, and
So I'm super glad you brought that up. I would love to have someone from the Issaquah Historical Society come and talk to us and share a little bit about the history of this park. My understanding is that it was purchased about 100 years ago by the volunteer firemen, who were also comprised of the baseball team, the town, like baseball players, and that they bought this, or I don't know if all of it, but they bought the property. They all pitched in individually and bought it so they would have a place to play baseball. And it's been used in those years for baseball. It also was a high school football field, and then has been gathering places for the community for the last 100 years. So it was disappointing. So I would like to hear more about that. It was disappointing to me that none of these options retained that part of our history, which was by completely eliminating any sort of concept of like using this as an athletic facility, which is what it was purchased for 100 years ago, and it has been used since then. And even as, so to me, I really wish there was one option in these that retain that feel and that
This
use.
is one of our flattest lands, right?
It's flat. It could be. It's right now. It was originally. It had been for many years a high school sized field. It's been shortened, so it's like a middle school kind of age field now. But a little league sized field, I'd be super curious to see like what would happen if you put in a little league field there, and what would that size? What else would it be allowed? And that would still keep kind of that same tradition. And if you couldn't do that, could you put in a wiffle ball field or like something?
So these concepts, as you will see, they do maintain an open field area for uses, whether it's salmon days for some of these other programming for other, maybe smaller fields or mod soccer or whatever for pickup.
If we wanted to become sports specific, that's part of.
We wanted to
that's part
retain the
of this
100-year
next-
history of being used as sports fields. So.
I hear you.
Okay.
Good point. We'll leave it at that.
The other thing, can I ask, this park does not have a restroom, I don't believe.
It does, actually, and next to the baseball field, there's a preschool there currently, and there's 2 stalls.
And also City Hall.
Yeah, there's one inside City Hall and then at the end of Veterans Memorial Park Center.
Okay.
So, thank you, Jeff, for a reminder of the art, because this one really demonstrates a lot of the history with its connection to the rail line as well as the depot and the museum. This concept really focuses more on some of the history of the site and really plays to some of the LAs and connections. It still creates a plaza for the senior center as well as an open field, but in honor of some of the history, a hot vine alley, also revamping a garden space over here, because that was one thing we really heard about this park in particular, is how can we increase gardens as a destination, as well as a splash. That was a really loud comment received. But this one, how can we also continue our cut-throughs and connections to the existing space and areas within the park? This also shows a connection to Alder Street, which is a future planned festival street, as well as the pedestrian park down in here.
Can you explain what's going on there with that rail station concept?
Yeah,
What's that?
Yeah, so the rail, you might better off see in some of the history. So, Issaquah, some of the concepts that would be integrated into the images that would be integrated would be, the history of the hops vines here, the alley as far as a treed walking garden, but also how we might interject the rail lines, but also playing how the rail is used for former transportation, but also how it could be used to reconnection with the Rainier Trail through there. So some really interesting concepts. They're not fully refined yet. They're just kind of little 30,000-foot ideas as far as history, and we're hoping to get a little more out of the community engagement storytelling about what that would look like in detail and whether or not this resonates with the community.
I think it's just, how do we take what is known as pedestrian park, right? And how do we strengthen that connection back to Veterans Memorial from that intersection, right? I mean, there you are at Front and Sunset, right? How do we, what do we do to reinforce, that connection?
And then here's kind of what some of the concepts and connections would be, demonstrating the depots over here on the left, what a playground might be in a plaza outside the senior center, as well as a splash alley connecting down. The next concept is really based upon the Valley Meadow concept. A lot of people live up in the foothills area, and when they come down to the valley, wanting to kind of have this super bloom loop, again with plants as a destination. There's more of an integrated civic plaza here with a splash play that connects to the senior center and City Hall and the depot, and creating some different connecting elements, but there's also a loop trail in and around the open field for play and some additional sports courts, and maybe a kiosk and a different seniors porch. Here are some different ideas where the shared street, to go back to the image, maybe parking during the week, but could easily be shut down for use, say on a weekend if there was a big activity going on in the park or the plaza area, or salmon days could be easily shut down. Here's some ideas as to what that space could look like. Making sure that, with the super bloom, that there was color and interest all year round. And here's a sketch as to what that plaza space would look like. Again, we'll be seeking additional feedback on parking art from the community as we go through these. And then this last concept is the foothills. And this is really intended to really be focused around play. We heard from the community some interest in providing some winter sports and winter gathering spaces. So while there's a loop splash play water feature, it could also double as perhaps an ice skating rink in the wintertime. There's also some additional spaces further connecting Depot Park, the senior center, to pedestrian park and Alder Street through here. This would assume there's a future for parking, since some of it is removed in here. But just demonstrating the extreme as to what potentially could happen in that space, and how the park and this whole civic campus area could really start relating to Front Street as an option. Here's what some of those images could look like, creating a little more undulating edge around that flat open area, introducing some native plants and what a splash play area could look like, and some plaza spaces. We're
So
getting, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, these three concepts are really trying to, the conversation we had at Park Board meeting last month about Veterans Memorial, and that, how do we consider that parking area, right? And these concepts are not, again, trying to design, but trying to at least solicit conversation on how programmatically might we treat that parking lot. Do we keep it as is and try and reinforce that connection to Front Street? Boy, what would it look like if, again, forward thinking, Stephen Padua in our conversation, if parking was to be sometime in the future accommodated some other way, boy, what would it look like for that connection of these spaces and the depot building and the park and all the history that's that close to Front Street? What would it look like to relate it on a more pedestrian scale? So not a right or a wrong, but just a variance of experiences.
So
Question, the splash pads seem like a ton of fun, but do we really have the temperatures? I mean, is there any kind of study that's been done to see what kind of temperatures these splash play parks get actually used in? Because I think that's a huge concern, is that it's probably pretty pricey, and would people use it?
That's a good question. They are used a ton here in the Seattle area and in the Northwest, and cities that have incorporated that idea of water into play. It's seasonal. You're absolutely right, April. It's seasonal. It's typically depends on the year, but it's probably Memorial Day through a Labor Day. I think when you have park spaces like this that are close to a commercial area, it becomes an amenity. Another opportunity for kids and families to play with water. They're quite popular in the Northwest.
So kids will get in at 70 degrees or 75 degrees, no
Yeah.
problem?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
Wading
gonna say-
pools get used and stuff like all summer long,
And two, oftentimes, many of the splash pads are designed, because you don't need a lot of surface grade to them, that when they're not in use in the off seasons can double up as a sport court or some
plaza.
other activities, or a plaza or a gathering space. So they are designed so they're a year-round functional space, and it's not just a temporary, you can't use it these other days of the
And
year.
some of
Marlene
them,
pointed out,
yeah.
Downtown Park in Bellevue just completed
Place is
a
nuts.
big play area, it's crazy. But there's a water element that's part of that and pretty popular, you would
It's
say?
really popular and, well, obviously, like, that park is just popular all the time. So, but the water feature is nice, and it's not overly, like, it's not huge, but it's super busy and people think it's really fun.
So from a park wonk like myself perspective, downtown park was years in the making, right? What downtown park didn't necessarily have was a strong relationship to Main Street. Had a strong relationship to Bell Square to the north, but not to Main Street. And one of the big goals of that play area project and that space was strengthening that relationship to Main Street. And I think it has in a lot
We
of
went
ways.
there on, what day was it, President's Day, first day of break last week. I bet there was 400 kids there.
Mhm.
It was crazy, like, people were one in, one out trying to park. It was nuts.
And this is, splash pad is really one thing that we heard from the community that they're desiring to have within the park system. I mean, we heard it in the park strategic plan, and it came out in these surveys as well.
And I don't think they need to be like, obviously a splash pad type thing either. I mean, like you go to some parks and they're like, it's like, in the off season, you would know that you're in the middle of a splash pad, but, like Gig Harbor has one that's like a fisherman, like right on the water, and it's like I think it's a memorial to the fishermen who have been lost, but it also has a water feature. And so if you're there and you can, like, it can be on, and like the kids love that too, and it then goes away, like it's
To be
a
incorporated
piece of art. It's
directly
amazing.
Into
Yeah.
art, exactly. There's a park downtown Vancouver, Esther Short Park. It's a Hilton Hotel that was just created. Esther Short Park was a tired park that was in really bad shape, totally renovated. Their idea of water play is this creek bed that, again, looks like a beautiful piece of art, but you go there on a 65-degree day or warmer, and it might as well be a splash pad. Yeah.
And you'll see in these concepts too, between Tibbetts and Veterans, we do explore kind of the degree as to which water can be introduced at these parks. So real quick, I want to be respectful of time here, and I'm going to kind of go super fast through this. There's really 4 different elements and themes that came out of the Creek Corridor concept. Obviously, our spine is the main route from getting us from Squaw Valley Park to the south, all the way up to Lake Sammamish State Park. But within that, we did hear from the community that with these green nodes being representative of existing park spaces or parks along the creek as destinations or anchors, how might we begin to create loops in and around that main spine to create neighborhood routes, neighborhood walking areas, but also if you got on the main spine, you could go down to another section or another route. And you'll see this in some of the graphics. So you could come down to Old Town and have your walking loop for Old Town, but yet maybe you have your neighborhood loop. And habitat, and honoring the creek and its natural habitat was super important. But how can we weave and still integrate our existing park spaces into that habitat while creating further enjoyment for the humans within that space as well? So these 4 themes you'll really see represented in the 3 different reaches. Pickering Reach, the spine is represented as the pink arrow with some opportunities for trail and habitat, but the loop would be, the secondary loop is this yellow, and you can see how that would then connect our existing anchor parks, which would be Pickering Barn and Emily Darst in this area. Here are some images as to what the Creek Corridor in this section of the reach would look like. Old Town Reach is going to have a little bit more of an urban feel just because of its location to development. It's pretty much I-90 down to just past Front Street Park here, with the pink being the main spine, again yellow representing loops in and around Confluence Park here. Ooh, sorry, I'm not sure why it keeps slipping. And then around Old Town, we might have an Old Town loop again, or a Gilman loop. How can we create walking spaces but then easily connect you? And obviously our wayfinding project will play into this as well, that we've been working on. And here's what some of those paths for the Old Town Reach might look like, a little more urban, but still respecting and honoring some habitat and some gathering areas. And then Squaw Valley Reach. Again, this is a much more rural foothill experience down here with a lot more complex habitat. Again, we've got connections along the main spine, but what a Squaw Valley Loop Trail might look like as far as connection to the existing spaces and up into the Squaw area reaches. So we're going to be going out to the community, asking for additional feedback on this, as well as how could art be integrated into the reach. What are some ideas or stories that would be told? So we look forward to hearing back from the community on all of these concepts. Again, the feedback's going to get merged into a preferred design, and from there we'll start a little deeper level of design and conversation for each site. As Jeff mentioned earlier, engagement to date has been collective, and we will start, because there's been so many repetition of, splash park here, garden there. After this process, we'll start breaking out into each park having their own path towards adoption, with the goal being completion by the end of the year.
Are we going to have a chance to see the survey before you send it out to the public?
That's a great question. I think
I would say, I would ask that we do. In the past, what has happened is we've had some surveys go out, and like the bridge being one, the Confluence Creek Bridge. Another one being when we did some surveys on a potential aquatic center, and our last, the priorities in our last park board or park bond, where a survey goes out, and then the park board, in our discussions, we have questions, or there were a question wasn't asked, or there are some gaps that are important for us to be able to make an informed decision. And there's not another chance to go back out, often to ask people again. So that's been a frustration of mine over the years, when kind of surveys go out and we don't, I'm like, well, it would have been nice to have this as an option, or ask this, or,
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I'm thinking out loud here. We're working with the communications team right now on framing that survey up. Perhaps we can send a draft of that out to you to look at electronically, and get some thoughts and feedback. It would be nice to have this survey out before our next park board meeting. I'm just, I guess, presenting that as an option and open to your thoughts and.
my other, like I expressed earlier, I'm very disappointed and concerned that one option at Veterans Memorial was not to retain some aspect of recreation, like active recreation. We have very, very few active recreation, like places that we can do that in our city. There's deed restrictions on a lot of our properties. We have Confluence Park that is just, I don't know how far that is, just a very short walk away, that has the meadows and has the feel of some of these options. And we can't have soccer there. We can't put a baseball field there, So I get it that we're trying to modernize the park, and it's not probably as well utilized as it could be. But, Issaquah Little League has 800 kids that they serve, and if you had that as a Little League field, there would be games there every night in the spring and summer. You would have young families there. They would get to know that park. They would love it. It's a great place to watch baseball. You go there, you have dinner, you're visiting, all the commercial establishments afterwards. It would be a different way that park has been used in the past, but you pair that with a splash pad and some other things, it might be a really cool, fun, family, oriented park.
And I think some of the ideas of those concepts for Veterans Memorial where, yes, we do want to honor field and community field. I think what those could be, whether they want to be formalized athletic or whether they want to be general drop-in is still,
Well, it's not going to be up for
Part of-
discussion when you don't give it as an option. It won't elicit, like, in some respects, what we have on this survey will shape, what that is going to be. And so if you don't have it as an option, you're not going to give anybody, like most people haven't used that field. Most new people to Issaquah haven't used that field. The old time, like people who have lived here a long time, like Brian probably played football on that field, or So it's meaningful for a lot of people, in the community.
I just also want to give voice to the other side and some of the community outreach and the comments we've received, which you as a park board have also received, is that it's underutilized. It's not utilized enough, and it's somewhat wasted space. So we're trying to balance, what is perceived as wasted space with still providing opportunities for diversification.
Okay, I just want to say, like, I feel like the opportunities for active fields is very, very small in Issaquah. And so to have between these two parks, to eliminate a third of our baseball fields, I think is a detriment to that community. And so I have kids that play baseball, they've played football, they played soccer, basketball, and swam. So like I've been to all of those community facilities. I don't favor baseball over any of those, but I do know that it's limited, and none of those baseball fields operate to their fullest. None of them are optimally kind of like, like they're not great right now, right? So they could all be used, and we probably don't need as many if we do them right. But I bet if you had a Little League field there, a size field, it would be used a lot. There's a lot of Little League teams in the area.
No, I think that's very good feedback, and perhaps one of those fields we show as what it would look like to be a little bit more formalized.
Yeah, and I would suggest for something like that, what I would put in would be a turf infield and just grass, like everything else being grass. And you could, if you do turf on this infield, you can use it all the time. That's what Dodd fields are. And it can be grass, it can be feel like, it does now. It can be used for salmon days and all sorts of community activities. And you could bring in temporary fences. At a Little League age, the temporary fences don't have to be super hardy.
Right, fencing flexibility would be key.
It would be a lot easier on a Little League field than an older kid field.
Right.
So has there been any inventory created for baseball fields in Issaquah? And also analysis to establish what the current and future needs are going to be?
Yep. We've been in process of that, and that would continue to be in process as we go through this work and get to this important next phase of work in terms of how we begin making decisions on these. Yes, that will be information that's going to be key in that in the next phases of this work. I think
At what point will that information be disseminated to the community so the community can make some decisions on reducing fields? I mean, like Danielle points out, we're reducing 3 fields out of 6.
Out of 9.
Out of 9, and it seems like the community needs to have that information before they can kind of weigh in on what concepts they might like to see for some of these parks. Because they might say, yeah, we can do away with all these fields, thinking that they want some of these other activities, but they also might not know how much use is actually being in these fields to even make that kind of a comment. So I don't know. It'd be nice for the community as well as me, all of us, to kind of know what before we start making recommendations to reduce fields, it'd be nice to know what the analysis is for that.
Yeah, I don't think we're at a point of making recommendations for reduced fields. I think we're at a point of, as we look at these parks and look at, I think, the competing interests and pressures, yeah, we have a history of 6 infields on these park spaces. Those 6 infields are very rarely, if ever, programmed at the same time, right? So they are very much underutilized. Something that came up in our conversation with the baseball groups and has come up in our conversations with the park strategic plan is we also have a couple of the other fields of those 9. We have 2 baseball fields at Central Park that are extremely underutilized and underscheduled. And so part of, as we move into this next phase and really start looking at that data and looking at decisions we're making park by park, keeping the whole system in mind, part of the implementation strategy of these parks may be, you know what, we need to, is recommended investments into those 2 fields at Central Park so that they can take on a whole new capacity that they've never really taken on. And so, you know, this survey, again, is not intended at this point to try and force an answer or force a reduction. It's trying to introduce the multiple pressures that exist within our park system, and how do we begin to at least gather feedback and help us understand and address these. So it's one of the, though we're going site-specific in beginning to look at these, I think it's one of the values in introducing these all collectively, because there really is gonna be some push and pull as we begin making decisions on certain parks. Boy, that makes sense if we also do this other work, or do this other work ahead of time. So I wish it was a beautifully elegant science that could be all sort of planned out, or we're master planning this all from scratch, but we're not. In a way, this is this idea of modernizing our system is sort of retrofitting as well.
As far as the survey, I agree with Danielle in that it would be nice for us to have some input about what that survey looks like to prevent gaps, because I agree totally that when these surveys are created, it can send you down a path that's really hard to pull away from later on. And so it's good to identify those gaps now before those kind of surveys go out, unless we were planning on having a multitude of surveys, but I don't see that happening. It seems like this survey is somewhat going to kind of dictate, in some respects, what the ultimate plan recommendations are going to be.
No,
Could be
no,
another
no.
survey.
This is really, we need to remember, conceptual design is your first step in the design process. You do site analysis, you understand the functions, you know where the wind and the sun and the parking and utilities, it's all background information. And right now, we're really looking at spatial layout and adjacencies based upon community feedback received to date. Granted, we're doing all 3 surveys. These are 3 large surveys, 1 for each park. So knowing some of the community may be interested in Tibbetts Valley Park, some may be super interested in the Creek Corridor, and some may be super interested in both veterans and Tibbetts, right? Or just veterans. So we're giving people the option to be able to pick whichever survey they want. Now, this feedback will then, these are just concepts, and as I stated earlier, the final preferred design may take several iterations and several steps along the way, which is why after this initial conceptual survey, they'll start breaking off into their own plans. You know, I see Tibbetts Valley likely needing a couple iterations of a preferred concept and maybe an additional survey in there before a final design is created, again, with a final survey. Did we get it right? So this is just a very cursory step in the process to really dream big, throw out ideas. Some of the things we've heard from the community are certainly reflected in these concepts, and is it really resonating with all of the community or just a particular, individual? So we're gonna have to see how that all plays out within these concepts, and balance the multiple needs and diverse thoughts through that. And so like when we come up with, say, on the Creek Corridor, we come up with a Squaw Valley Reach preferred design, it may go through 2 or 3 iterations before it hits a final design process. There could be, Creek Corridor, I think will also have multiple opportunities for surveying and community engagement and open houses along the way before we hit into that. So please don't feel like this is we're designing it today. This is just an introduction.
I know we're running out of time, but I just want to say, I really, really wish we had come up with, had done an analysis of how many baseball fields we have, what the need is, engage with the local baseball community to kind of have them input what the gaps are in our current system, what the number of fields and size of fields are available, that we kind of need at least to maintain the status quo of programming, not even talking about, growing. And then incorporate those in these designs. So the city knows the best with that community what size fields need to be there. Not necessarily the layouts, but which ones. So if I'm a community member and my kid doesn't play baseball, I don't really care if it's 3 little league fields and 1 big field or whatever. They're just fields on a thing. I actually really care about that, and to me to do it this other way and without doing it that way, I just feel like we've just made it
Uninformed decisions.
we're making an uninformed decision and we're leading people to give input on, down a path. We're going down a path that might be really hard to pull back from.
I think you could have that same survey for every interest group, though. The skate park folks, that skate park's packed to the max, and there's little kids there with 30-year-old people, and it just looks hazardous to me. And so there's all these different interest groups, and you could go to the garden folks and say, well, how many different species do you need to have in the garden? So I'm not sure if we could really get it would take years to get a good handle on how each special interest group would really ideally see the different needs playing out in the different activities. So, it would be tough. It's going to be tough because the historical use, it's always hard to lose something, but I feel like how do we assess how much use one activity will get in the future, and how we see things kind of diversifying or not, or staying with one sort of historic use. It's a really challenging. I don't have any suggestions, obviously, but it would be great to have this information for all of these activities that we're considering sacrificing current use for.
I think that's the trick. It's like, what are the things that you're looking to take away? Because the reality becomes, if you're trying to make this new great big park, and the narrative becomes, they've taken away this thing, and you get a whole group of people who are super passionate, really talking about what you've taken away from them, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. I think just be careful there.
Oh, very careful. So this is really good discussion. I think there would be some value in us. We're not trying to sneak a survey by you as a park board. This is really good discussion. I think we should send out the draft of the survey and get some feedback from all of you. I think that we are not trying to take anything away. And if I can share some of the feedback we heard from the baseball group, 6 representatives who we met with. We had just gotten some of these initial concepts. We've tweaked some of them since. But in the conversation with them and talking about what are you historically using and what are your needs, I heard a consensus from that group that was not a sense of you're taking something away. It was, wow, this would be an ad. This would feel like an ad for baseball.
With the caveat that the assumption was that the Central Park Little League fields were gonna be turfed and expanded, so they were able to be fully utilized.
Absolutely.
So,
Cor-
you know, so like that, I just, you know,
Okay, I'm not trying to debate you,
Yeah.
Danielle, but I'm trying to say relative to Tibbetts Valley Park.
yeah,
And again, I wish this was easy, you guys. I wish competing pressures are easy in a system. It's not. But to your question, you're right. What we might be rethinking at Tibbetts Valley Park, and Danielle, you're absolutely right. The implementation of doing something at Tibbetts Valley Park would need to include investments at Central Park, right? To increase the capacity of those baseball fields. So at the end of the day, we're constrained with land. Our Issaquah Park system, we are rich in many things. We're extremely poor in land. And so how we try and modernize, diversify elements in our park system and do it in a way that nobody feels like they're losing, but that groups are feeling like, yeah, I might be reduced in the square footage that's been dictated for this single use, but wow, it's a win in the end. That's, I think in the end, that's all of our collective goal. So,
And really introducing that year-round playability too, you know, which a lot of these fields aren't experiencing right now.
Because they're underwater.
Yeah.
In the
I mean,
survey,
you can't play baseball right now at Tibbetts Valley Park.
in the survey, is it intention that different amenities and different concepts are going to be set up so people can kind of almost vote on them, so you'll actually get percentages rather than this being a free form?
No, there's a lot of open-ended questions. There's a
it's
few,
intended to be open-ended.
yeah,
We're not trying to create forced choices.
no.
We don't want forced choices at this point.
Okay. And then the other aspect would be, and I know this was raised at the city council meeting about cost, and I know cost issues are not practical at this level, but they might be practical at least along the similar lines of like we did with the dog park in terms of, here are three concepts, here's the most expensive concept, here's the least expensive concept, so at least you could get the community kind of to weigh in on how much, where do they want to go with it, you know? You know what I mean? Whereas if you throw out, and you don't talk about that, people might just, yeah, much like the
pool.
Confluence Bridge or
Yeah.
whatever we keep raising, people might be gravitated to what looks the best, but in reality, it might never happen because it's too expensive. And so to get the community to at least start thinking about different layers of cost at this early stage, even though it's a high-level stage, would be practical, I think, rather than to just not talk about it at all. I know that was one of the concerns that Victoria had. I have the same. I think there are other people that it would be nice to at least touch on that some way. Not down to the pennies and all that, but you know what I'm talking about? I thought what was done with the dog park in terms of 3 different options was a good way, you know, to introduce cost into the picture when people are starting to make their decisions about what concepts they like.
And I mean, I really hear where you're at, but at this level, it's also, there's so many unknowns and variables with each. It's almost not cost effective for us to go through the exercise.
The hard
until
thing
we
is
get a
these
little more.
these concepts incorporate ideas that don't necessarily follow that same line of, here's the, you know, the Yelp, here's the $2 sign concept, here's the $3 sign concept, and here's the $4 sign concept, because there's elements and ideas sort of blended that would be hard to try and associate at that level. As I answered to Council President Andrews was, or Hunt, was, yes, cost, I think as we start to develop more refined concepts or ideas for a preferred concept and start to, I think, get more specific on those elements, yes, I think there will be a time when we'll want to, I don't think this is gonna be the last survey or community outreach we have. There will be, I think, need and opportunity for some of those lessons learned from some of the previous work that's been done on, there is a right time to start to understand relevant interest in investment. Because ultimately, that's what these parks are as well, right? How interested is the community in investing in their system?
I have one more little thing that doesn't relate to baseball, with Tibbetts. Is I was hoping that there would be some sort of vision, like alternative visions for the Tibbetts Creek Manor in these sketches. A number of years ago, the city went down a path that it ended up pulling back from, but to do covered tennis courts, to cover the existing tennis courts. And it was going to be a lease relationship with a private, it was going to be a private-public partnership. And one of the reasons that we pulled back from that is because we knew that we're going to be doing a master plan in the relative near future, and we wanted the flexibility to be able to re-envision that land. I look at the manor as a location that's, could be conducive to something like that. It's not in the sight lines of sort of the valley. It's off of 900. You could still connect to the park. So I was hoping that there would be some options, something like that, like a covered tennis facility or indoor, like another kind of rec center that could have like indoor activities like basketball. I don't know, but something other than, retaining the manor there. And I was hoping that if it had something, like some of those options, then it might get people thinking about like, well, what else might be able to go in there? But by just keeping in all of those 3 sketches, it just says like, manor house.
There is a question in the survey that talks about some different functions to kind of help prompt some ideas
For that space.
for that
It's a great
space.
point.
But for that space, I would love to see some options that just, where we're making a decision, this is a recreational park, we're gonna have active indoor recreation here. We can move do we need a wedding facility? Do we need meeting, maybe we can have meeting space somewhere else, in downtown Issaquah and something that we own.
Yeah, no, great point, and I think, well, on a professional note, I think what we'll find, this is one of those hard things, but the true creek setback, most of that manor is already in, to put a new facility or a new amenity on that site, I think we're gonna find that between SR 900 and the creek, it's a pretty constrained area. But I think your question is a great one, and that I think the survey is trying not to, and this is to your point too, Brad. I don't think we're at the point of trying to create a bunch of forced choices with the survey. I think we're still wanting more qualitative feedback to help continue to spur ideas, opportunities for that area. But it's pretty clear, and council has shared as much as well, that we have a manor that's aging, that's fatiguing, that it's time to rethink not only its space as rental, but also how might that portion of the park
If
have
you
different
couldn't
uses.
build another facility, could you do something else, so recreation-wise, like a climbing wall, or is there a small
Introductory
space
play
that?
area,
Mhm.
Parking that feeds into the creek weave, or if that's, yeah.
Anyway, I think that was an opportunity that was missed, and just in including something that you could maybe would like pique people's interest and get them thinking and get some feedback about what it is that they'd like to see there.
So one last thing I probably wanted to put in relating to the creek corridor is, there isn't anything in any of these reaches regarding the Mountain to Sound Greenway corridor. Is that intentional, or do you see any value in including that? I know it's somewhat uncertain in terms of where it might be, but it was kind of a significant component of the strategic plan to have the east-west and north-south corridor with kind of a hub of the intersection, and it seems like that needs to be included somewhere along the line in one of those reaches, so people can be aware of it. It's an important component, and yet it's kind of missing in the creek corridor concepts.
I think it remains very much a key a key hub and a key concept. I think I think that creek concept plan is gonna, where we have two projects that are site-specific, that is a more multi-parcel plan. Not knowing exactly where that Mountains to Sound Greenway trail is going to land, or there might be multiple crossings, right? I think reinforcing the concept that where that crossing is, that crossing becomes, or crossings, plural, becomes a hub, right? And so, I say that all to say that that idea has not been lost, and those connections are a key priority. How to visually identify that on a map might feel forced right now, but perhaps in the survey, I know we talk about trail connections and other pieces that, again, I think as you see that draft survey,
Yeah.
how might we be drawing that out?
The draft survey was really more focused on just those four themes as far as the spine, the loops, the existing park spaces, and we have opportunity for people to list other destinations. Now, once we get a little more refinement on some of that, I can see then next phase of design, how does that connect into other areas within the city and other routes? I think it's likely something that will come up in the next phase.
Yeah.
Just at this real cursory stage, I think it's a little, we can also throw out too much information for people, and the creek corridor is a lot for people to take in, because it's so much land and so much space, and so we really just focused on those four pieces, the spine, the habitat, your anchors are existing park spaces, and we have an opportunity for other connections in there, and the habitat as the priorities. So,
Great point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not lost. Yeah.
Just as long as that hub is identified before any creek corridor master plan is
oh,
established.
we've got
is-
several iterations of this yet, and several opportunities for input.
I think there's key trail links that will be, East Lake Sammamish Trail, Issaquah Preston Trail, Mountains of Sound Greenway Trail, There's so many, when you think of again, the opportunity this city has to define this north-south anchor to its system and all the regional trails that are gonna link to that, in some ways, those are all gonna be hubs
Right,
to
right.
that. So your point is very well taken.
Okay. Well, we knocked that one out of the park here, didn't we? But we need to have good discussion about it, because I know you're at a kind of needing to move on with your adventure, and it's good to have some more feedback. So that wraps that, I assume?
Yes, and
Okay.
thanks to all our professionals.
Now, I know you
including-
were going to have a quarterly, are you gonna do that still?
We're
or
gonna
you-
do that next month.
Okay, I thought that's
Yeah.
what I'd recommend.
Yeah. We're gonna
That
do
way
that.
we don't have to rush through
We're
it,
gonna
because
do
I know
that.
you got a lot of good stuff in there.
We're gonna do that next month, and we've got a couple of other updates that I'll hold on until next month. I wouldn't, if you don't mind, just 2 minutes
Sure.
of personal privilege. You may or may not know, my dad passed away just a couple weeks ago, and
Sorry.
I think that always sets perspective and context for you, right? He's battled Parkinson's for 30-plus years, amazing man, gave me a passion for serving community, and I just think moments like this, it reaffirms my sort of the path that I have been on, and what's led to my choosing this crazy career that leads to really fun, dynamic conversations like this, and never easy tasks of helping community build amazing parks and recreation systems, but some of that is sort of founded in my dad, so just wanted to
Thanks for
just
sharing
honor
that.
him, yep, so
Sorry
thanks.
to hear that. Any other pieces from you now, or wait till next time?
Let's
or-
wait till next time,
Okay.
there's several, but they take a
Okay.
while.
And the only thing I wanted to add is, or reiterate, is that make sure to put in board applications by the end of February. And April, your term's up at the end of April. And So we'd love to have you continue on, and if so, please get your app in. And that applies both to Joe and Carl as well, if you're watching from above. And that's all I had. So, if there are any other
I have
comments?
I have
Yep.
one. I was
You
just
bet.
gonna say, I'm gonna send an email out to everyone. Back in November, we had a presentation on green Issaquah, and we've developed this partners list, and I was gonna share that with you guys if you had any contacts with some good partners, and also maybe some corporate sponsors, if there's any connections with some of the local businesses. So I'll be sending that out in the next day or so.
Good, good. Anything else?
Just a couple takeaways from our discussion. Again, thank you. What I heard was perhaps we'll have some conversations with the consultants about a couple of tweaks to concepts, and then also look for a copy of that survey going out to you electronically to take a look at it before we finalize that and send it out. So,
Sounds good.
thank you.
Thank you.
That's good.
When the
Everyone.
survey goes out, how would we provide feedback then? Just email a response or something?
Yeah, so it'll be an online survey. The city has a pretty robust tool, Peak Democracy. So when we send that out, part of our work with the communications team is it'll be a pretty big sort of social media blast and other things that once you get this link, whatever assistance you can give to not only complete it, but broadcast it out to your associated
Well, I think she
interest
was-
groups.
Sorry, I think she was talking about the survey we're sending for feedback, not
Yeah.
the survey
Oh,
itself.
the
So,
feedback, sorry,
yeah,
the
don't
sur-
send that one out to everybody.
Don't blast that.
Thank you, I went way too far ahead. Yes, to give us feedback on the draft survey, just email that back to us.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Wow.
And I would imagine, so we're looking for like, I would think, like gaps or
Yeah.
like follow-up questions or, sort of like
Yeah.
something where like,
It would have been nice to know.
would have been
all
nice to
along.
know this, yeah.
And in advance of doing that, I might recommend that you all go back and take a look at the survey comments received to date to help inform you about some of the concepts, why they look the way they do. Might be helpful to help get the brain going.
Mhm.
Okay,
Awesome, thank you.
good. Thanks, everyone. We're adjourned.
Yeah, that skateboard,